Hello, this is Andrew Thake from Minds and Money. Delighted that for this keynote Fireside Chat, I'm joined by Remi Piet, co-founder of Embellie Advisory, one of the leading experts in Latin American political risk, ESG, and the mining industry within that region. Delighted to go and meet you today, Remi.
No, thank you very much. That's a very positive introduction. I hope I'll be up to those standards, but I appreciate talking to you as always.
Okay, well, let's just dive straight in with the questions. Changing political sentiment towards mining in Ecuador, Colombia, Chile, and Peru. What do miners and investors need to be aware of?
Well, I mean, we just had, a series of different panels on M&A, and we've seen the interest of trying to look at, more probably frontier jurisdictions, because some of the traditional assets, there's a lot of competition for them. And obviously it might be more interesting to, open up more range of new jurisdictions. But obviously when you do this, you open up yourself on another, segment of above the ground risk in terms of ESG inclusion of some of those projects, community relations, especially the series of traditional political interference or regulations changing in different jurisdictions. That's what you have to be extremely more cautious of, understanding those different elements. Be able to quantify them, seeing what kind of are your biggest weaknesses or strength as a company to be able to operate in those jurisdictions. And we talk about in Latin America, we might be covering 4 countries, but Suriname, Guyana are some very up and coming frontier jurisdictions in terms of precious metals. Bolivia for base metals always been there, and it's interesting in terms of its stability, although no right wing stability, but stability in terms of the political leadership in the country. So that's where it's interesting for investors that are now looking at able to travel on site after the pandemic's restrictions, hopefully, and be able to have better sense and hire good third party to give them their perspective on those above the ground risks to go and engage into other jurisdictions. Some have been very successful in the past. I'm thinking about Lundin in Ecuador before Ecuador became so trendy, and now there are other jurisdictions that are on the bridge of picking up, while some traditional I'm thinking about Chile, I'm thinking about Peru to a lesser extent. It's been interesting to look into it, are being seen potentially are more challenging in a mid to long run. So another balance in terms of interest here.
Yeah. You've spent most of your career advising miners and investors looking at Latin America. I had actually written down the question, what are the most common mistakes they make, which is a bit of a negative question. I'm going to split it up into like 2 questions. What do people like Lucas Lundin get right? Which I guess and then sort of probably helps to answer the second question that I had written down. And what are the most common mistakes that people who aren't Lucas Lundin make?
Well, I mean, you're right. I spent a lot of time boring people about Latin America with my academic take on things, and I'm coming with the PhD in Latin American, politics. But the key point here is to understand that it's not about the national level. It's about, subnational levels, understanding, your jurisdictions, your mine site, being able to hire the right people also inside the company that have this understanding of interacting with a range of different stakeholders. If you want to be successful in those jurisdictions, you mentioned, some Lundin properties, and we're seeing, different new moves in other jurisdictions outside of Latin America, such as Sudan, for example, or in Latin America also. We're seeing those interests in this capacity to see what is the, immediate surrounding of the mine, how to be able to build trust, through foundation and through different works, assess the risk also to be successful. In the case, if we're talking about Frontera Norte in Ecuador, for example, that was building good work from Kinross. Also, let's be acknowledging this, but also be able to work, at different levels of interactions, not only with national government, thinking that because you have good relationships in a lot of big rooftop towers in Lima or in Santiago de Chile or in other places, you'll be able to have your project work. No, it is more at the level of the province, in Antioquia, in Colombia, in San Juan, in Santa Cruz, or in Mendoza, in Argentina, to understand where are the projects that make sense and then implement them with the right teams.
Mm-hmm. How is the investment climate towards mining in Latin America as a whole different to say how it was 10 years ago?
So it's obviously extremely evolving, and we're seeing one of the key elements of Latin America has been a certain political instability. I mean, we're right now looking at a key political change in Peru, which I would actually argue is and it has to be understood in the sense that yes, it's a shift towards the left side of politics in terms of a series of different issues, but there are some key understanding of the importance of the mining sector, and some elements showing that if you're actually able to make sense of social profitability, we actually might, look at the specific term from the, the Castillo administration, you can make the case for your mining project and move forward. But obviously, I say, political instability, we're going to see that in Brazil probably next year. We're seeing some underlying worries in Chile through the constitutional changes that discussions right now that will include de facto elements of rights of access to water, a series of potential new human rights and indigenous community rights. That's a key element in Latin America. A lot of those countries are signed the ILO 169 in terms of the Convention of the Rights of the Indigenous Communities, and that a need for free and prior consent of communities that leads to consulta previa, different models of consulta previa from Peru to Ecuador, Colombia, Peru being more advanced on that one. So it's interesting to try to see this and be able to include it in terms of your choosing your assets that you want actually to acquire, or run the company once you actually are able to build those elements of trust with the communities, and not only at the level of the capital city. I don't know if you want to dig into one specific countries, but I'm happy to expand.
Yeah, so we sort of like, when we sort of like were chatting before, and we said let's go and talk about 4 countries today. So I think the first one that we've picked is Ecuador, that you've already sort of previously mentioned. Now, there was a report that I read that said that mining exports were up 74% last year. So is it all good news as far as Ecuador is concerned?
Well, first of all, when you look at large numbers like this, we have to put them in perspective. Ecuador is an up and rising, jurisdictions, interesting to look at. But it's not like if Peru had an increase of 74%. I mean, we have new projects that arrive. Obviously, the Cascabel, Fruta del Norte, we mentioned them, a series of interesting projects from Ecuasolidos, Guarinza, others such as Adventus Mining, very interesting projects also there. So you have new projects that arrive, and the production will continue increasing in that jurisdiction. Now, this also is following up to a trend where you had indeed a political change with the Guillermo Lasso administration, right-wing administration, market-friendly, with an agreement with the IMF, and showing up this trend was away from the traditional correísmo that has marked Ecuador and put them on the series of jurisdictions where less investors were more cautious before investing. So obviously you're seeing a positive trend, but then again, you have to dig a little deeper in terms of the analysis. There are very strong forces. Guillermo Lasso was on opposition sides. Guillermo Lasso was elected to go on the second round only with 16% and a couple thousand votes ahead of the indigenous community leader Yacu Perez, and especially in regions such as Mora, Santiago, Zamora, Chinchipe, in the south eastern part of the countries, and even Loja or Azuay. You have to understand how to build with communities and make the case for mining there. It is possible, but obviously there has been a series of history that you have to build to change, a narrative to change, being able to reach out on the other side of the aisle and make the case for mining in regions where mining's had a bad press for a lot of informal miners, a lot of corruption into mining in the past, and so therefore, and especially at the level of Paramo regions, impact of water. This is where you have to be very cautious on doing your due diligence rights in Ecuador. If you do and actually understand the right projects that will move forward, I mentioned a few of them, then you can be successful in Ecuador, but you have to be including really the inclusion of ESG, especially for investors and institutional, bankers. They will only invest in Ecuador if you can make the case for sound, led projects following, the sustainable development goals, because of the other cautious and let's say orange lights on Ecuador.
As a follow up on that is, can you have, and do you have a situation in Ecuador where you can have the national government being a one political leaning persuasion, but then the on the ground at the local government level, having local government authorities that you're dealing with being sort of like a very difficult political persuasion? So we, for example, have that here often in the UK, because the local county elections are at a different cycle to the political national elections, where we go and elect the Houses of Parliament. Is that kind of how it works in Ecuador, or?
So it's a very interesting point that you're making. It's quite true, not maybe for that specific reason, more for historical reasons in Ecuador, of the weight of Quito as opposed to other provinces, and kind of loathing or looking, at a neo-colonial power from the capital city. You see that also in Colombia between Bogota and Antioquia. If you want to run operations successfully in Antioquia, you actually need to have teams from Antioquia. It's hard to run them from Bogota. There's very capable people there, but you need to have a very strong team in Medellin to run those. Same thing in Ecuador. So you have those elements of the capital city versus the political movement that you can have at the local level. This has been traditionally the case, especially with Korea, very centrally minded some would say authoritarian leader, but actually elected on elements of having all the means of power more in Quito, and has been resented from more regions that are less developed. And so the mining, narrative in there is seen, from the capital to the region. That's where you need to build those bonds with the local actors. You have to make the case through local content methodologies, through community participation tools. There's plenty of them. I would expand a lot more on these on some, if that's what we do. So I'm happy to talk about it more. But the idea is to be able to create those links in those elements to create those political alliance at the local level also. And that's the case for other countries that we can mention.
Yeah. Another question which I've written down to ask you at this point here, though I guess it's obviously common with all sort of like countries in Latin America, specific challenges of First Nations there.
Yeah, so that's very interesting. As I said, the ratification of the ILO 169 from a majority of those countries, that has actually different, impact. Whether you look at, Peru, Mexico, Colombia, or Chile, I mean, it's really different in terms of how that impacts the legislative body in terms of mining jurisdiction. But there's a specific address to indigenous communities and let's say where to work and protocol to follow. So, for example, a very good work that has been done by the previous administration in Peru in the MINEM in terms of trying to underlay the rules for understanding the rights and the kind of framework to work with indigenous communities. A lot of work done also by the Canadian embassy supporting that work on creating some methodologies of interacting with indigenous communities. And there are some clear steps to follow. I mean, there's 5 different steps, and there's different ways of identifying those communities, seeing what kind of rights there are and the impact that it has. If you do these rights, you can actually really have the capacity to move your project forward. However, if this is not really strictly followed, and this is where you will have opposition from different groups using obviously the fact that you didn't follow the juridical rules and the way to follow your process with popular consultation against your project and a series of similar steps. So it's very important that mining companies, especially towards indigenous communities, follow the right steps. They're different from one country to another. In Peru, there's a specific approach to it. I'm happy to develop on this, and other for Ecuador, Colombia, that are developed right now in other countries. And Mexico is not liar here as Brazil, but we're seeing some changes in terms also of the affectation to those indigenous communities and how mining companies need to integrate this in terms of their narrative communication, but also their processes to make the case later on to investors at the exploration stage specifically.
Is there an example in either Ecuador, or if not another Latin American country, of a mining company that has managed to really do a great job, a really great case study of a mining company, either in Ecuador or another Latin American company, at engaging with First Nations and getting them on board and on site with their mining project?
So there are a few of them. I'm thinking about Peru in particular. You're seeing a large, exploration companies now very active in engaging better with indigenous communities. We're seeing projects that have been able to make the case for, stakeholder engagement and some value creation with communities. I'm thinking about, Bay Creek, for example, with the Korani project is one that strikes a chord here. There are other projects that were very effective in Colombia. I'm thinking about, companies like Mineros S.A., which is a little off the board because it's not quoted at the TSX. It's much more a Medellin-based company that has worked a lot with informal miners, for example, not specifically on the indigenous community side, but that is also the capacity to be able to implement the right methodologies and understand both the legal framework, but also the kind of discourse to have, the ways to build consensus both with indigenous communities and then with informal miners, to make sure that those become then you advocate for your project, because you contribute to their lifestyle and to livelihood. You actually include them in the project, you gave them a voice, you include them in the process. They will help you for the project afterwards and secure investors for the mid to the long run, which are the investors that you actually want to secure. But so yes, in terms of, I mentioned these, there's Calibre Mining is doing good work in Nicaragua. I could actually I didn't prepare a list of those companies, but I'm happy to give some advice to anyone that will reach out after.
Yeah, I'm just trying to sort of stump you out by asking you some questions that we hadn't sort of like pre-agreed on. So my apologies sort of for that, Remi. Let's move on to some questions that we had sort of pre-agreed that I would go and ask you. We did say let's also talk about Chile. There was a recent news story suggesting the Lundin family were going to focus on Argentina rather than Chile. What is your take on Chile?
So, I mean, there's two questions in one here, and then that are very interesting. Obviously, I mean, Argentina is actually quite bullish also on Argentina. I mean, Argentina needs to develop their mining, exports specifically on the ongoing, economic situation. The Jose Maria projects, that you're referring to for Lundin is the one that has strong potential, that has a good, managerial team. There's obviously the community elements and understanding the legal situation there that is important. But that's why there's attraction towards Argentina, and that's coupled with some worries as to Chile. Chile that has always been kind of the well-behaving, if you very market-friendly, let's say, jurisdiction in terms of mining. As a result, assets are quite expensive also in Chile. There is a series of changes, upcoming changes in terms of at national level, but more than anything, this new constitution that will arrive in Chile. There's right now a constitutional assembly that has been gathered with a series of representatives, especially more left-leaning, and so we'll see an inclusion of other elements that, as I mentioned, the right to access to water, which can be an issue in Atacama, can be an issue more in Arica, Antofagasta, Calama, all the part of the north of Chile where water resources are scarce, or more for indigenous communities. And I'm thinking about projects more in the Puerto Montt area. It's more for, let's say, renewable energy projects there, for example, and similar things that we can see in Oaxaca for Mexico, where there are some mining interests also further down in Chile that can be impacted by this. And so this is where a series of companies that want to be clear in terms of being more ambitious towards their approach to it and more proactive rather than reacting to constitutional changes along the way. I'm moving towards Argentina, where the situation is different. You have an Alberto Fernandez administration, which is not considered as the traditional market-friendly administration, obviously, as opposed to the Macri administration before, but that has been constantly supportive of mining. I mean, Santa Cruz, which is kind of the family of Kirchner and the origins of the movement that led to Alberto Fernandez's victory at the elections, is a pro-mining jurisdiction. San Juan also, and so you see other jurisdictions in Mendoza, maybe not Chubut yet, but even if you actually were to be able to have this conversation with indigenous communities, specifically in that case, there are those some smaller projects that could be very successful there. But yes, key projects in Argentina that make sense, and again maybe in Peru also, we can mention in the future.
Yeah. And just until you talked about some of the recent legislation, how about the impact of the copper royalty bill?
So, I mean, the impact on copper in different jurisdictions, obviously, you need to drill down on different metals and other. I mean, on copper, it's an interesting one. First of all, there are, the market has been, strongly supporting copper over the last few months. There are, a series of more, restriction and kind of incoming, new royalty schemes or other elements such as more standards from the copper mark and other on certification on this. So yes, it is a moment where the market and different, actors, whether political, trying to increase the kind of monies and that we get from copper exploration are using this, because at the time of the pandemic, it's one of the few, sectors that has been quite, well addressing. But those are elements where that would also be making the case when you look at royalties change. I think the key element is not so much royalties in itself. I mean, it is obviously the amount of royalties that you have to pay, but also the way that they are disbursed back. So if they're coming back to your jurisdiction where you operate, so basically that offsets the kind of investment that you would have to do in infrastructure or in water. I'm being very schematic here. But if it is as the case, for example, in Mexico, with the change from the AMLO administration of channeling royalties through the federal government in the education government ministry, and therefore not really coming back to the jurisdiction of where you had the project. Same thing was the case in Colombia, and that led to a series of issues in the past in Colombia of lack of support to La Colosa or to Quebradona on some of key interesting projects from Anglo Ashanti. I would encourage to look into it. Those are elements that are more important: the disbursement and the capacity for this money to trickle down to your communities. Whether you have to pay a couple more % or not is important, but it's more whether your communities see the impact and positive impact of mining, and therefore do not block your roads, do not prevent you from having the kind of licensing that you need, and don't put you bad press in the newspapers that actually scare away your investors.
Yeah. And just a question on Argentina. I think that, gosh, when I first joined Mines and Money, is sort of, I think Argentina went through a phase of being quite popular with miners, and then it went through a phase of not being popular again. And I remember hosting a panel on Argentina where one cynical investor labeled Argentina as where mining money goes to die, or some sort of put down phrase. So it now seems to be kind of positive again. Lundin family looking at Argentina, but again, for me, with my less knowledge about Argentina than someone like yourself, Remi, it seems to me that it's always just changing every few years. It's going from hot to cold to hot again as an investment jurisdiction. I mean, what's not to stop it sort of changing again in like another 2 years' time?
So I mean, the discussion on Argentina, you have those ongoing phrases that can, because in terms of political economy, yes, indeed, the series of political economy that have been implemented in Argentina over the last few decades has led to a decrease of the relative importance of the Argentinian economy in world affairs, and having a series of crises over the last decades. Obviously, so that's a key story, as opposed to South Korea or other countries that have been much more successful in the last few decades. And so when you look at Argentina, you look at what can bring consensus here. Indeed, there's swings to the right, to the left. The Kirchner, former Peronist party is always there with, Alberto Fernandez now in power. And you had, a kind of a hope towards, Macri and his reforms for right-leaning interests in Argentina, and he hasn't been able to convince the population of trickling down the wealth and get some support from his good reforms that he had done at some point, especially in terms of pension, in terms of a series of opening up back to international competition. And then the swing to Alberto Fernandez has created this wave like a blizzard, coming from the north of, or maybe not Argentina. We're back at it again. Now, if you look more in details, and that's especially the case for the mining sector. Again, as I said, the traditional support of a series of representatives in Mendoza from the Alberto Fernandez party, even when they were in the opposition towards, in favor of mining. The law 7722 that was on different use of chemicals or processes in mining in Mendoza, this was actually supported by the Alberto Fernandez party. And as I said, one of the strong pillars of this Alberto Fernandez Kirchner party is in Santa Cruz, who's the sister-in-law of Cristina Fernandez, is governor of Santa Cruz, hopefully still, but she was at least until very recently. I think I'm still right. But that creates a strong power in terms of understanding mining. There's a history of mining. Same thing as there's a history in mining in Antioquia, when you look at Colombia, or in Belo Horizonte, Minas Gerais in Brazil, or in Peru. There's a very strong importance of the mining for the country, and therefore there's an understanding to it and a support to it. That's why we haven't seen kind of negative position from the Alberto Fernandez administration on mining, as we've seen, for example, for other sectors of the economy, such as meat exports. That is something very big in Argentina, increasing the exports to it and doing an embargo on it, so that you actually reduces the prices for everyday citizens also on meat. That's not the case for the mining sector, and there's some kind of a I wouldn't say bipartisan support to the mining industry. There's different ways of looking at it, specific angles. I said Chubut is very specific, but San Juan, Uli Project, First Quantum Takataka, they have a very interesting project in Peru, also Akira, that I would encourage to look at. That are projects that can make sense depending on who is in power in Argentina. Then it becomes economic factors and crisis, but we're at a time where everyone is in crisis, if I may say so. I don't want to scare everyone, but we all went through a pandemic. So the relative situation of Argentina is not as daunting that it used to be. And so it makes more interest at looking at some very underpriced assets. And I think it's a wise move to look at Jose Maria. I had a good conversation with him recently. It's a good project.
Okay, thank you very much for that. The third country we chose to look at today is Peru. The Castillo government is leftist. What changes has this brought the mining industry?
So the Castillo government is very interesting when you actually look at how it came to power. First of all, the country has been doing well over the last 2 decades economically, and that's why the mining sector has been also very strong and prosperous. Mining represents 60% of exports in Peru. I mean, we're talking about a mining country. But when we have a series of different political issues at the national level, the Congress was actually at the time considered very, very poorly, and then a series of presidents. Look at the history of presidents in Peru. 4 out of 5 are in jails, or one of actually killed himself. So it's a very complex political situation locally. And came the elections recently with June 6th, with so many candidates, disbursement of votes from let's say center and center right, to leading to having 2 extremes in the second round. Keiko Fujimori, daughter of her father, who actually has been the cause of a series of issues, obviously, and then terrible human rights abuse in areas in Peru, and resentment from communities and vast provinces. So they would never vote for his daughter. And Pedro Castillo, that was actually the bearer of the left-wing party, more extreme even than others, such as Victoria Mendoza. And so that created a lot of scares because of the origin of his party. Now, Pedro Castillo is one, man and president of Peru. But then you have to look at who he actually has, built as a team. He pulled in, Pedro Franchi, which was the advisor to Vittorio Mendoza, which is much more, understanding of market forces and including, elements of looking at money investment as, and that's the key term, socially profitable. So we can go back into what that means, okay, a little bit later, but trying basically to include them into the larger, inclusive development of different territories. There's an agrarian reforms that will happen. There's a series of key reforms in the economy that will scare away markets probably, but that doesn't really impact so much the mining sector. I mean, if you're able to, protect some key projects, there might be, there are renegotiations on key projects that are already existing, but we're seeing strong rhetorics towards encouraging, new exploration projects. Even, Perumin just happened, a few weeks ago, and there was very encouraging words from the BHP CEO and a series of country managers saying that they understand the plan from Pedro Franchi and Pedro Castillo in terms of moving forward towards another angles towards mining. We were arriving at a point, in Peru where there was a lack potentially of because of the history and the kind of ways that mining in Peru is developed. There was maybe lack of innovation and trying to include and follow the wave that we've seen on including new stakeholders locally, as we've seen in other jurisdictions like Canada, mentioned Ecuador or Colombia could be another one. And now we actually see the need for mining operators to be more proactive in working with communities. If they do this, they will be able to make the case for their projects. And Pedro Castillo does not have the political power to change the constitution in Congress. He doesn't have a majority in Congress. He cannot change the level of royalties across the board on mining. He doesn't have this level of votes to be able to pass this. So his only play is either to call for a constitutional assembly, which I don't think will happen. There's going to make a lot of noise, or also try to negotiate or put pressure on individual or at the state level. And that's where, again, it's not going to be at a national level that you have to work. It's about being able to make the case for your project for, the rules and protocols, and make the case for the inclusion of social profitability. So mapping of SDGs. I mean, sorry, I'm put the academic back on and explain this if you want on how you can make a case to the development of mining.
Yes, so kind of on the statement about the president said projects with social profitability will get backed, and those that don't have social profitability won't get backed. Is social profitability just like another word for ESG?
Yeah, it's very similar. It's maybe the difference is, first of all, what do you call ESG? And we could go into it. We did a publication on ESG in Latin America specifically on this. There's been very strong advances on the E of ESG, so environment. So you have very strong due diligences that are made on tailings that were extremely needed. We remember, when we talk about Brazil in the Brumadinho Dam, San Marco Dam. So it's focused on the environmental impact on water, also a key element, especially at the Paramo region that I said, for Colombia and Ecuador, a bit in Peru also. But what has been lacking is progress in terms of social and governance. So basically, in a series of jurisdictions, you still have, the mining sector being seen as the ally of a potential, corrupt elite or corrupt parties because of the history, whether it is the decades of history of conflicts in Colombia, whether it is a vision from indigenous communities in Chile and Argentina. All those divides actually are putting mining with a very poor reputation of just protecting the interests of so many. And so that's why when you talk about social profitability, that is being able to link with those communities, being able to make the case that you actually create the collaboration bottom up, and we do a series of community suppliers for local content, project development for local content. All of these are what are going to be able to make the point for the licensing entities, which are independent in Peru, but they're always a key narrative and a capacity to make the case that you are working towards this will help you. So that's why we talk about social profitability. It's maybe a focus on the S and the G of ESG, not containing the E, it's important, but being able to talk about community participation, make the case for social development through education and health. Work with other UN agencies in terms of projects for health and education for the communities, and work together in terms of supporting projects in the agrarian sectors, for example, or in other sectors locally. I'm thinking about regions such as Apurímac, Cusco, Puno, the Puno region, or even Huancavelica or Cajamarca on a series of key projects that could include those new methodologies to make the case for their social profitability.
We've kind of mentioned ESG quite a few times now within this conversation. I'm just curious because obviously, as I mentioned in your intro, one of your key areas of expertise is ESG. How more, I guess, ESG aware has the mining industry and the mining investment community in Latin America become aware? And I guess the question behind the question is that many Westerners, such as myself, who I have to say have never been to Latin America, so I have to say there's a huge caveat, have this perception that Latin America is 10 years behind the West when it comes to ESG and implementing ESG standards. Now, I'm guessing I'm probably wrong, and that's a misperception, but can you just tell me why I'm wrong on that?
So first of all, happy to tour you around whenever you want, different mining jurisdictions from Central America to Latin America. That's a void that you need to complete, if not only put for the experience. It's amazing to be there and understand those places. Now, the mining sector has made some, in terms of awareness, it has been there. I mean, let's be very clear. You have some very good professionals in different mining companies. You have an understanding of what should be done. I mean, obviously, it can be evolving even better, but you see clear steps that are being done in Latin America, specifically because of the specificities of the indigenous communities element. As I mentioned, IL 169, that created a series of legal imperatives that have not presence in other jurisdictions. So the presence and the understanding and the awareness is there. What is lacking is two things. First of all, being able to pass the message. And you look at sectors sometimes that are so important in the economy that there's a lot of conflictivity linked to it. I mean, we all know about Tia Maria, about issues with, in Las Bambas in Peru, and other, like Colosa in Colombia, a series of projects that have been, facing with, retaliations or violence in Ecuador also. So all these as linked to a series of conflictivity between communities and mining companies. So there needs to be a capacity to pass and create the conditions for, more collaborations and engaging mediator if you need to, having new tools to be able to have community participation, so that you make the case that you are on the side of bringing the social profitability in Peru or ESG in other jurisdictions, specifically S and G, as I was saying, in creating conditions for better communication, not a top-down communication. A lot of mining jurisdiction projects have in the neighborhood, in the city, they have two newspapers, one in favor of the mining industry paid by the mining company, one against, supported by the NGO. So you're passing information, but you're never communicating with each other. And the same thing with Donald Trump and President Biden here in terms of debates. I mean, the question is being able to bridge the gap. So that is where mining companies and investors are failing, to be able to bridge with communities better, and sometimes having the confidence to give it to third parties to mediate and facilitate the conditions, not only through top-down communication or kind of information. And the second one, probably where there's elements that should be worked on is maybe, and that's the problem with S&G, is the capacity to have sound data. It's not easy to have data in financial elements, but it's quite quantitative, it's quite easy, okay? But when you look at social and governance, what is your data that you have to handle? Qualitative, quantitative, it's very hard to quantify those. And how do you measure that? So there's a series of tools that are limited because they're from the mining company, that allows you to track down the efforts in CSR or community relation. But the objective would be the other way around. And so there's a series of platforms. Citizen Lab is one which actually we work with on different mining jurisdictions to be able to have community participation, having the data from the community, of understanding what would be their needs and allowing them to express themselves and just answer their concerns, pass them sound information and so on, but therefore deconflictivize those regions. And then if that's what happens, you already have, as I said, the awareness, the capacity of very strong professionals, very strong actors, key in the industry of many companies that understand ESG, they understand how to do it, but just don't manage to pass their message along and have it implemented soundly and unbiasedly, monitored, if possible, by third parties. That'd be much better. And not only reported through different ESG sustainability report for the market or other, which are important. I mean, the responsible gold mining principles, towards sustainable mining, the copper mark, we do work with all of these, and they're important to be able to report these, but to be able to have it as a communication tool, like a constructive communication tool with the communities, create a political support, and therefore mitigate against those socioeconomic risks that are the ones that are failing your projects. That was a very long answer. I'm sorry, Andrew.
No, it's no problem at all. And I realized as soon as I asked the question, I said I've never been to Latin America before. That was actually a lie. I have spent 2 days in the last country I'm about to ask you about, which is Colombia. I mean, 2 days is obviously not nearly.
We need to have a Mines and Money Latin America, and we'll bring you tons of mining company investors interested in Latin America to create that interest and bring you over.
Yeah, we definitely do. Colombia, what do you make of the Minister of Mines there, or Minister of Mines and Energy there, Diego Meza, and some of his policies?
I mean, good professional, again, that's another place where you have, good professional in the mining sector. The problem with Colombia is not at this level. It's just, instability, potentially politically. Ivan Duque had a complex, administration, is arriving to the end of his term. There's no capacity to just be re-elected in Colombia. So there's going to be a very disputed elections next year. You had a rise of, I'm going to say, Green Party movements, but the Green Party movement in Colombia is very specific. It's very much more towards better governance and more transparency, more than only on environmental issues. Kind of the same thing as the French Europe Ecology Party at this time. So it's very similar to this approach. So you actually can talk to the Green Party there. Yes.
And sorry, just to interject on kind of green parties. Are green parties a common thing in Latin America? Because here in the West, I'm just thinking out loud, in nearly every country there is a Green Party, and in some countries like Germany, the Green Party is very important, and I think it's often a crucial part in the ruling coalition. Here in the UK, it gets 1 or 2%. How important are Green Parties in?
So it's not as important as you would think. There would be in a specific country where Colombia definitely is one, Brazil is one where the Green Party is actually quite active. In Chile, it is also, there's a presence of a Green Party interests. But the reason is why it's not so active is actually under another name or another, when you look at Pedro Castillo, that, I'm not saying that he's a Green Party leader, he's more leftist, but when it's more of a cause of indigenous communities. And so basically indigenous communities, Pachamama, Mother Earth, this is very much linked to more circular economy. When you talk to indigenous leaders, and you listen to Yacu Perez in Ecuador, for example, he talks about circular economy. So circular economy is what European Green Parties talk about also. So are the indigenous communities parties considered the Green Parties? Maybe not, because they have a very specific element, which is the indigenism and position towards mining on this one. But so in other countries where there's less so of an activity, such as in maybe a little more mature or more influenced by Western powers, in the case of Colombia, obviously American influence as opposed to other countries in the region, you have the rise of a Green Party, more of an urban Green Party. Butkus was actually arrived to the second round 2 terms ago, made 30%. You have the mayor currently now in Bogota is from the Green Party. Fajardo was a key candidate last election, will not run probably from new elections from Medellin. But you have here the likelihood that Colombia might swing for the first time on the left wing of politics. The narrative on the civil war is not as predominant as it was. Although actually very recently one of the leaders of the LNA was actually imprisoned or killed, if I'm not wrong. Sorry for that. But there's clearly progress on the element of the conflictivity there, and so the discussions are much more on traditional conversation of distribution of welfare, tax reforms, education, pandemics, and a series of mismanagement from police forces in Colombia have actually antagonized a large part of the population against the power in place, the cracking down on demonstration and others, and the steady rise of left-wing parties. So we're going to have a change power next year. Hopefully you don't have the same conversation and we have another Centro Democrático administration in Colombia, but you see a slight fading away of the strength of the Centro Democrático, and that will have some impact in terms of mining projects and mining investment, especially in up and coming jurisdictions, and maybe some elements of social profitability that we talked about. Peru might actually be interesting to look at for implementation in Colombia. There's key things that we've seen and done in Antioquia in terms of the concept of ecominería, so adding the environmental elements to the mining investment for local sustainable development, inclusive development. Those are kind of the seeds that will be preponderant in different projects in the future.
One last question I wanted to ask you, because we're nearly out of time. One other common country I wanted to ask you about, which is not a Latin American country, is China, of course. China seems to be, again, as an outsider, seems to do quite a good job at managing political risk when it goes into Latin American countries. And again, it seems to have involvement in Ecuador, Colombia, Chile, Peru, in fact, all the countries that we've mentioned today. Is there anything specifically that Chile is doing to manage political risk or managing risk on the ground in Latin America that maybe other countries aren't doing?
So you mean Chinese investment in Latin American mining and their results in terms of inclusion?
Yeah,
so,
it just seems to be that whenever I read about Chinese companies, whether it's mining companies or whether it's the investors who've got involvement in Latin America, I don't know, they seem to be kind of like, they seem to like de-risk themselves by just understanding the political landscape, I guess, better than sort of like
So
others.
So let me maybe try to bring a different line on this, and we've seen indeed, especially on merger acquisitions or working together with partners in Argentina, for example, with Barrick, or in Chile in terms of looking at the lithium space in SQM, and we've seen the capacity now to partner with local actors, which is very important. Okay, however, in terms of the track record for political risks, in terms of seeing the reaction to Chinese investment, I mean, we mentioned Ecuador. I mean, you mentioned the Lundin as the classical good case for kind of Canadian mining, Canadian Swedish in that case. But in terms of mining locally, Ecuadoriente is kind of maybe on the other side of the equation. So Ecuadoriente is a Chinese investment in the Mirador mine that led to a state of emergency in 2016. And so there's been a very strong and violent situation in the region, and maybe a lack of understanding of how to really work at the local level. I mean, clearly, when you actually travel to Tundaime, which is the city of Mirador, and then you go to Yansasa and to Los Encuentros in the region, you see a difference in terms of the local development. So I think in that case, it would not be in that line. The same thing, we're seeing concerns potentially in Colombia, the good work made by Continental Gold in Buritica. When Zijin took over Continental Gold, there's increased activities from informal miners now, increased security issues that you see in the region. Might not be specifically linked to Zijin, and obviously there's change of protocols, but also to the pandemics and other elements. So I don't want to put the blame on someone, but there's sometimes, and more often than not, a lack of understanding of how to work with local actors, even more of a cultural divide, even more of a capacity, a tendency to sometimes turn to your, embassy in a capital city and say, look, you have to tell the government to help us. And by the way, remind them that they owe us $50 billion. So that actually, and being very, very schematic. And the approach from Canadian companies has been slightly different and maybe a little more proactive and interesting. Australian companies are starting to develop interesting methodology, especially in Ecuador and in other places, and in Brazil. There are a few projects that we keep an eye on, and so it's a very different basket when you look at the performance of everyone. But again, whether you're Chinese, Australian, Canadian, when you have to operate in Latin America in specific jurisdiction, you have to open the hood of the national level, look at the regional and local level, put in place sometimes through a mediator, a third party that can create the conditions for being able to discuss with communities and therefore move forward your projects and as early as possible in your process, and there be able to quantify with different metrics. And happy to dig deeper in terms of the metric of the social and governance, but we need another half an hour to do so. So maybe that's not the moment to start.
Unfortunately, I think for the next time we should have a whole separate panel, a whole separate fireside chat on sort of China. Well, it's been an absolutely fascinating chat, Remi. I'm really delighted for your sort of time today, and I would encourage anyone who's listening in on this is that, if you are looking for the number one expert within the mining industry who knows his stuff when it comes to political risk and political risk management with regards to the mining industry in Latin America, it's definitely Remi. So Remi Piet, co-founder of Embellie Advisories, thank you very much for your time today.